Welcome. You found your way to a quiet place, a corner of the night where we move more slowly and let the noise of the surface world fade. This channel is a shared vessel for calm journeys into the deep ocean, into hidden layers of our planet that most of us will never see, but can still imagine. Stories shaped by depth, pressure, time, and long stretches of silence. And if you'd like to return to this place again, a quiet like or subscription helps keep these slow journeys afloat. For now, make yourself comfortable. And let's begin our descent. Tonight, our path doesn't lead over ice or across a glacier, but straight down into water so deep and so distant from the surface that it might as well be another world. Our destination is Challenger Deep, the deepest known point in Earth's oceans, a narrow fold in the seafloor at the southern end of the Mariana Trench, nearly 11 kilometers beneath the waves. Down there, the pressure climbs to more than 1,000 times what you feel at sea level, enough to crush most metal shells as if they were made of soft clay. Imagine that for a moment. Above your head, not just a ceiling or a roof, but almost the entire height of Mount Everest, made of cold, heavy water, pressing from all directions. No sunlight reaches that place. There is only darkness, a still black volume, where days and nights at the surface blur into the same endless midnight. It is quiet in a way we almost never experience, a quiet broken only by the slow settling of sediment and the distant groan of shifting earth. And yet somehow life is there. Tiny microbes clinging to grains of mud, translucent amphipods drifting over the trench floor, perhaps ghostly snailfish cruising just above it, their bodies shaped by millions of years to endure a world of crushing pressure and permanent night. What else might be moving through that darkness, just beyond the reach of our cameras, just outside the narrow circles of light we've managed to send down? For all our technology, all our ambition, and all our restless desire to explore, we have only visited Challenger Deep a handful of times, and only for a few hours at a stretch. Not because we don't care, but because this part of Earth quietly resists us. Our submersibles strain, our sensors falter, and the distance itself turns every attempt into something fragile and brief. We've mapped the surface of Mars in far greater detail than this single hidden wound in our own ocean. So, as you slow your thoughts and feel the room around you grow still, follow me. You don't need to remember any numbers or hold on to every name. Let this be a slow descent, a guided fall through layers of water and darkness, from the familiar surface to the deepest quiet on Earth, where almost no one has been, and where for now we can only visit in short, careful breaths of time. A hidden abyss. Why Challenger Deep feels more alien than earthly. Down there, at the very end of this guided fall, is a single narrow scar in the seafloor. It has a quiet name, Challenger Deep, yet it is the most extreme known place on our planet. A slit in the crust almost 11 kilometers beneath the surface of the Pacific, where the weight of the ocean piles into more than 1,000 times the pressure you and I feel in the air right now. We often picture the deep ocean as one uniform darkness, a simple, endless blue that just keeps getting colder and dimmer. But the Mariana Trench is more like a vast curving wound in the earth, and Challenger Deep is the deepest fold inside that wound, a cold, still pocket where light never arrives, and sound travels strangely, compressed by all that water pressing inward from every side. Now, picture what happens to anything that tries to sit there for long. Metals bend, seals creep, electronics fail in ways that are hard to predict. Because of that, our view of this hidden world is strangely blurred. We have detailed, almost seamless maps of Mars and the Moon, their craters and ridges traced out meter by meter. While the floor of Challenger Deep is still sketched in with broad strokes, its true shape softened by distance and guesswork. Not because we don't care, but because radio waves, GPS signals, and ordinary cameras simply can't survive that journey. The physics of water, darkness, and pressure erase most of the tools that work so well for us in space. So we send down special submersibles wrapped in thick hulls and tiny spheres of air, and they visit for just a few hours at a time, touching down like cautious landers on an alien plane. We know that some life waits for them there. Pale amphipods scuttling over the mud, strange snailfish that seem too delicate for such a heavy world, films of microbes drawing energy not from sunlight, but from slow chemical reactions in the sediment. But what else might be moving just beyond the edge of our lamps, just outside the narrow cone of our attention? We can't simply park a laboratory there and watch for years. The pressure would crush most long-term habitats. Cables would fail, batteries would drain, and every attempt to send a constant stream of data back up through 11 kilometers of cold, shifting water becomes a delicate compromise. For now, Challenger Deep allows only brief visits, short, careful breaths of time, and then it closes over again. In that sense, it feels less like part of Earth and more like an alien world tucked inside it. A trench that might hold forms of life, patterns of chemistry, and slow geological processes we haven't yet imagined. So, make yourself comfortable, slow your thoughts, and follow me. We're going to sink toward that abyss together in the chapters ahead, pausing at each layer to ask what could possibly live there, what we actually know, what we only suspect, and why this deepest quiet still keeps so many of its secrets just out of reach. Where are you listening from, compared to 11 kilometers down? So before we go any farther down, let's pause for a moment up here, where you are. We've been talking about this dark, distant place beneath the waves, but right now, you're not at the bottom of the ocean. You're somewhere very specific on the surface of the Earth, in a small pocket of warmth and light and familiar sounds. Make yourself comfortable wherever that is. Maybe you're lying in bed, the sheets soft against your skin, the room dim, a little pool of glow from a phone screen or a bedside lamp. Maybe you're on a couch, half listening, half drifting, or out on a late-night walk with headphones on, your footsteps a quiet rhythm on pavement or soil. Maybe you're in a chair, back resting, eyes closed, just letting the words move past like a slow current. If you like, follow me through a few questions. What does the air feel like on your face right now? Is it warm or cool or somewhere in between? Can you sense a draft at your ankles, a blanket trapping heat along your legs, the gentle weight of clothing, the texture of fabric? What temperature is the room, not as a number on a thermostat, but as a feeling on your skin? And underneath all of that, can you hear anything at the edge of your awareness? A distant car, a refrigerator hum, a clock, a neighbor's voice, your own breathing. Now, picture what happens when we take that same body, that same quiet awareness, and place it only in your imagination, 11 kilometers straight down. The air vanishes. The temperature drops toward the cold of near-freezing salt water, a steady chill pressing in from every side. The sounds fade until there is almost nothing. No wind, no traffic, no voices, only the slow creak of a submersible hull or the soft hiss of sediment settling on sediment in the dark. We often picture the ocean as a flat blue surface with fish just below it. But beneath the soles of your feet, if we could draw a line straight down, there could be a vertical column of water stretching those full 11,000 meters, like a liquid canyon stacked directly under you. Imagine your body resting horizontally, on the bed, the couch, the park bench, and then rotate your mind so that from your spine downward, that column drops away into blackness, past sunlight, past the last traces of color, into a region where the pressure is more than 1,000 times what you feel at sea level. And somewhere at the very bottom of that invisible shaft is Challenger Deep, a place so remote that fewer people have been there than have walked on the moon, yet it is still part of the same planet that is holding you up right now. If you'd like more quiet journeys like this, slow descents into hidden parts of our world, you can, if it feels right, tap like or subscribe. Not as an obligation, not as a demand, but simply as a way of helping this small, gentle corner of the internet stay alive, so that we can keep returning to these cold, deep places together. For now, though, there is nothing you need to do. The ocean is vast, the night is long, and there is more than enough time. Just listen, let your thoughts slow your thoughts a little further, and we'll keep sinking, layer by layer, toward the floor of Challenger Deep, where life endures under pressures we can barely imagine. Letting go and sinking slowly, transition into the journey. So before we go any farther, make yourself comfortable. If you can, let your shoulders fall a little, loosen your jaw, and allow your hands to rest wherever they land, as if gravity has grown just a bit stronger and is gently insisting that you let go of the day you've been carrying. Let your breathing thicken and slow, not forced, just a little heavier, as though each inhale has to sink through a column of water and each exhale rises back toward the surface. As you do, slow your thoughts as well, the way silt settles when the current finally calms. We're going to borrow that stillness for a while. Now, follow me. We leave the shoreline behind, almost without noticing, the last streetlights slipping away behind a faint haze, the sounds of the city dissolving into a soft blank hush. Ahead of us, there is only a dark horizon, a cold, wide place where sky and ocean blur. And somewhere far, far out there, a tiny point on the map where the floor of the earth suddenly drops away into the deepest trench we know. We often picture the ocean as a flat blue sheet, a simple surface that you might skim across in a ship or glimpse from an airplane window. But beneath that surface is a three-dimensional world, layer resting on layer, like invisible floors in a building made of water and darkness. Near the top, sunlight filters down and colors still exist. Lower, the blue fades to gray, then to black, and life must invent stranger and stranger ways to glow, to feed, to endure the growing pressure. Now picture what happens as we keep gliding over the Pacific, past the familiar shipping lanes and island chains, until the sea floor below us suddenly steepens, then plunges. This is the Mariana Trench, and at its deepest point, Challenger Deep, the bottom lies almost 11 kilometers beneath the waves, under more than 1,000 times the pressure you feel at sea level. It has been there for millions of years, slowly carved where one of Earth's great plates bends and dives down into the mantle, sinking grain by grain, long before any human ever tried to measure how deep the water could be. In this slow descent, time itself feels different. A minute stretches, a century compresses. The trench does not hurry. It has watched ice ages advance and retreat, continents drift, entire species appear and vanish, while it simply continued to deepen, a narrow scar in the crust holding a hidden, silent column of water. As we sink with it in our minds, the rules we live by on land begin to soften. Light disappears, sound travels in strange, bending paths, metal would crumple where delicate animals somehow survive. This changing world of darkness and pressure is not just background scenery. It is the reason why, even with our best machines, we can only visit the bottom in brief, fragile moments. In the next part of our journey, we'll step through those layers one by one and see how each new depth quietly closes another door on exploration. The ocean we think we know versus the abyss we almost never see. So now, after touching that world of darkness and pressure, we can gently rise back in our minds, up toward the ocean we think we know. We often picture something simple, a blue sheet stretching to the horizon, waves rolling in slow rhythms, ships cutting pale tracks through the water, beaches where light scatters on the surface like broken glass. From an airplane window, it almost looks flat, calm, knowable. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine we press pause on that familiar scene. A warm shore, people swimming, sunlight trembling on the skin of the sea. It feels like a friendly place, the kind of water we meet on holidays and in photographs. But that bright film of color is only the thinnest mask. a few meters of life and motion, hiding an entire cold world beneath it. Follow me as we begin to peel it back. In the sunlit zone, where most of the light reaches, the ocean behaves almost the way children's books show it. Coral gardens, silver schools of fish turning as one, turtles drifting like slow thoughts through clear water. This is the layer our cameras love, because it looks like a floating forest, green and gold, and full of movement. Now, picture what happens as we let ourselves sink a little farther. Colors drain away, first the reds, then the oranges, until everything slips into deep blue. We enter the twilight zone, where light is more memory than presence, and shapes pass above us like distant clouds. Below that, the midnight zone begins, a place where the sun never arrives, where life makes its own faint sparks, and the pressure quietly climbs with every meter, year after year. But even that immense darkness is not the end. Carved into the seafloor are narrow wounds, trenches that slice down much deeper than Mount Everest is tall, the Hadal Zone. Places like the Mariana Trench and Challenger Deep are only a tiny fraction of the ocean's area. Thin lines on a map, yet they hold some of the most extreme conditions on Earth, where the pressure would crush almost anything we build, and the cold settles into every grain of sediment. If we could stand there, at the bottom of one of these scars, we would see steep walls falling into blackness, slopes where sediment can suddenly avalanche in slow, heavy cascades. The mud itself is thick with chemicals, a kind of dark soup that may feed hidden microbes, while cracks in rock and folds of sediment form tiny sheltered pockets, microhabitats where strange communities might cluster, unseen. From the surface, none of this is visible. The ocean presents a smooth, reflective face, as if it were one continuous, gentle volume of water. But beneath that calm mask lie canyons, cliffs, and pits that might as well belong to another planet. To understand why Challenger Deep is so hard to study, we first have to accept that most of the ocean is already as remote as any distant world, and the trenches are the most remote places of all. In the next part of our journey, we're going to leave this layered picture behind and descend in detail into one of those scars to see what little we know and how much still refuses to be seen. A world that pushes back, why Challenger Deep erases our attempts. So, follow me now as we finally drop into that scar, into Challenger Deep itself, and let yourself slow your thoughts as we do. Because what waits below is not just distant in space, it is distant in possibility. We often picture unexplored places as blank spaces on a map, waiting patiently for us to arrive with better tools and more time. Here, that quiet assumption begins to fail. It is not simply that we haven't explored Challenger Deep yet, as if we were just running late to an appointment at the bottom of the world. It is that this cold, crushing place may never allow us to explore it fully, no matter how clever we become. Because the environment does not just sit there beneath the surface of the ocean. It pushes back, gently but relentlessly, against almost everything we send down. Imagine a depth of nearly 11,000 meters, where the water above stacks into a single immense column of weight. At the bottom, every square centimeter feels more than 1,000 times the pressure at the surface, over 16,000 pounds for every square inch of hull or cable or tiny electronic seal. Steel that seems rigid on land can warp like soft clay over hours. Glass spheres meant to protect delicate instruments can implode without clear warning. And tiny flaws that would be harmless in shallow water can become fatal weaknesses in the deep. Now picture what happens to a submersible or a lander as it settles onto the sea floor. Its frame flexes, its joints compress, its seals are squeezed so hard that rubber behaves almost like metal, and metal almost like something alive, slowly flowing. Cables that carried power and data so easily at the surface can fail in ways we barely understand. As layers of insulation are crushed, microscopic cracks grow, and salt water finds paths inward that we did not predict. Not because the engineering is careless, But because this part of Earth operates under rules our everyday experience never has to obey. And when we do manage to reach the bottom for a few precious hours, the deep has another way of erasing us. A lander's feet stir up fine sediment that has been drifting down for years, maybe centuries, until the water becomes a snowstorm of mud that hides everything from our cameras. Tracks pressed into that soft layer fill in almost as soon as the weight lifts. Fragile animals may shatter under our lights and vibrations, or simply slip away into the darkness long before our lenses can focus. It is as if the world beneath closes over our visit, smoothing itself back into anonymity. In this sense, Challenger Deep is not an empty void waiting to be catalogued, but a patient, persistent editor of our presence, corroding, crushing, and obscuring anything we leave for more than a short stay. To understand why this place resists us so completely, we first need to understand what it actually is, and how a trench this deep can even exist on a planet like ours. And that story begins far above the seafloor, in the slow collision of pieces of Earth itself. To understand the deep, we first have to understand the ocean itself. So, before we sink all the way down into that narrow cut in the crust, make yourself comfortable for a moment at the level of the whole ocean. Because to understand why Challenger Deep is so hard to touch, we first have to understand what the deep ocean actually is. Beyond just a big dark space, we often picture it as a single uniform volume of water, a kind of endless cold basement under the bright living surface. But the ocean is layered, almost like a slow liquid atmosphere turned upside down, and each layer is its own world. Near the surface, where sunlight still reaches, light and warmth feed drifting plants and fish. Storms stir the water, and the sea feels close to the air and to us. As we go down, light thins, colors disappear, temperature falls, and pressure rises, until eventually there is no day or night at all, only a permanent midnight that has lasted for millions of years. Scientists divide these depths by how far light can penetrate, by how quickly temperature changes, and by how much weight the water above can exert. And each zone has its own physics and its own biology. Now, picture what happens when we pass through the last traces of blue into a place where the pressure is hundreds, then thousands of times what your body feels at the surface. At around 11,000 meters, where Challenger Deep lies, every square centimeter is carrying more than a ton of weight from the water above. Metal bends, electronics fail. Living cells must be redesigned by evolution just to hold together. Under all that, we might be tempted to imagine the seafloor as a simple, gently curving bowl, a quiet bed where sediments slowly settle out of the water. Not because we are foolish, but because from far above, on maps and globes, that is how it looks. In reality, the floor beneath the ocean is broken into vast plates of rock that drift, collide, and dive back into the deep interior of the Earth. And where one plate is forced under another, the crust is dragged downward, carving long, narrow trenches like the Mariana, with Challenger Deep at its lowest point. So Challenger Deep is not just a hole in the ground. It is the visible edge of a system that reaches far below the sea floor, where rock softens and flows over millions of years. Those same deep processes raise underwater mountains, open new basins, and reshape the paths that water can take as it moves. Because the water is moving too. The ocean is not a still pond resting on this rough stone, but a restless, layered fluid driven by winds, by the turning of the Earth, and by differences in temperature and saltiness. Slow, heavy currents sink in the cold polar seas and creep along the bottom, carrying oxygen and tiny fragments of dead life toward the trenches, while warmer, lighter waters slide above them. These flows decide how much food can ever fall into a place like Challenger Deep, and how quickly any chemical trace, any signal from the rocks or from life, can spread back out into the wider sea. If we want to study the deepest point, we have to send our fragile machines through all of these zones, across sharp temperature boundaries and powerful currents. down into an uneven landscape of peaks and chasms still being shaped from below. Follow me then as we leave this broad view of the ocean as a layered moving system and begin to ask a harder question. What does it actually feel like? Down where light has never been, and how does anything living survive the cold, the darkness, and the almost unimaginable pressure, falling through the layers, light, pressure, and the slow crush of depth? So, make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because to answer that question, we're going to do something simple and impossible at the same time. We're going to fall very slowly through the ocean itself, not as a machine, not as a diver in a suit, but just as a point of awareness, sinking straight down from the surface into the deepest cold place on Earth. At first, it feels almost familiar. We're just below the surface, where sunlight still dances in bright, shifting patterns, and the world above us is a trembling mirror of sky and cloud. Fish flash silver, colors are clear, and the water seems open and light. But even here, only a few meters down, the pressure has already changed. Every 10 meters we descend adds roughly one more atmosphere, one more layer of air's worth of weight, pressing in from all directions, even though we can't feel a boundary. Follow me a little deeper. Around 10 meters, 20-30, your ears would ache if you were really here, because the water is already squeezing the air inside your body. By 100 meters, the reds have faded away, swallowed first by the water, warm colors vanish, and the world turns blue and green. The pressure is about 10 atmospheres now, 10 times what you feel at the surface, as if 10 entire columns of air had been stacked on top of you. And still we are in the upper skin of the sea. We keep sinking. At 1,000 meters, no sunlight remains. The last blues are gone, and we float in a darkness that is not night, but something deeper, because it has never known a sunrise. The pressure has climbed to around 100 atmospheres, enough to crush an empty metal cylinder flat, yet the water holds it calmly, as if nothing special is happening at all. That is the quiet cruelty of pressure. It is invisible, constant, and patient. Now picture what happens as we continue, down past the familiar world of continental shelves, down the steep walls of the trench, until we reach the floor of Challenger Deep, almost 11,000 meters beneath the surface. Here, the pressure is more than 1,000 atmospheres, over 16,000 pounds on every square inch, the same as the weight of dozens of jumbo jets, or a small mountain resting on the space of a single postage stamp. How could anything soft survive that? Under this slow crush, matter itself behaves differently. Gases that would billow and expand near the surface are squeezed into tight volumes. Metals and plastics we trust on land can bend, creep, or fail. Even the water becomes slightly denser, its molecules packed a little closer, leaving it less willing to compress further. Years of engineering are needed just to build a shell that will not buckle. And life, if it wants to exist here at all, has to build its body from the inside out with this in mind. No gas-filled cavities that would implode, no fragile membranes that tear under stress, no proteins that twist into the wrong shapes when the pressure climbs. Any organism in this hidden world must be a quiet negotiation with the squeeze itself, its cells, its chemistry, its very structure tuned to a constant, crushing embrace that would destroy most creatures long before they ever reached these depths. Because before we can ask what lives here, we have to accept this simple fact. At Challenger Deep, even existing is an engineering challenge. Time-lapse of a trench, how the Earth bent itself into an abyss. So to understand how any of this became possible, we need to zoom out in time and let the whole sea floor move in slow motion. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine the solid ground beneath the oceans not as one unbroken shell, but as a mosaic of vast slabs drifting very slowly on a deeper, hotter layer of the Earth. We often picture rock as fixed and eternal, but on the scale of millions of years, It behaves more like an unimaginably slow glacier of stone, flowing and bending under its own weight, driven by heat rising from below. These great slabs are what we call plates, and they slide past each other, pull apart from each other, and sometimes, very quietly, one begins to sink beneath another. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady downward lean year after year. Now, picture what happens in the Western Pacific, where an old, dense plate of ocean crust meets a slightly lighter one. In our time-lapse, the older plate approaches like a dark conveyor belt of seafloor, carrying cold basalt, sediments, and the quiet weight of countless years. As it reaches the edge, it does not stop. It folds downward, tipping beneath its neighbor and diving back into the interior of the Earth. As that plate bends and sinks, it drags the seafloor with it, carving a long, curving crease into the planet's surface. That crease is the Mariana Trench, a narrow, bowed scar where the crust is pulled downwards by its own sinking edge and by the immense pressure of the plate above it. For tens of millions of years, this has been happening in almost complete darkness, grain by grain, fault by fault, the trench deepening as the plate continues its slow descent. Along that curve, the geometry is not perfectly even. Some segments bend more sharply. Some carry more weight in the form of thick, waterlogged sediments that have accumulated like a heavy blanket. Where the angle of the sinking plate is just right, and the load of overlying material is greatest, the seafloor is pulled a little farther down. That is Challenger Deep, not a separate hole, but a particularly low note in an already deep song. If we could drain the ocean away and stand at the edge, this would not look like a simple groove. It would be a vast, narrow canyon in the exposed world of rock, deeper than Mount Everest is tall, its walls rising steeply from a dark, muddy floor. We're going to walk there in our minds, cliffs of fractured crust towering above, terraces and ledges where landslides have torn away the sides, a long, shadowed valley stretching for hundreds of kilometers under a cold, airless sky. Follow me a little farther in this thought experiment. The floor of Challenger Deep would be a quiet grey plain of fine sediment, the crushed remains of shells, dust, volcanic ash, and minerals that have drifted down through the water column for ages. Above, the canyon rims would seem impossibly far away, thin lines on the horizon of this inverted mountain, reminding us how much of the Earth's relief is usually hidden beneath the sea. All of this has been sculpted over tens of millions of years. More time than our species has existed, more time than most of the life we know has had names. That long, slow bending has given any organisms that reach the bottom an equally long span to adapt to the cold, the darkness, and the pressure, or to fail and vanish, leaving no trace we can easily find. And it means that the world at the base of the trench is not a recent accident, but a stable, persistent place, a deep destination that life has been quietly testing, exploring, and sometimes enduring for far longer than we have been aware it existed, because to ask what might live there, we first have to see it not as a simple depth on a map, but as the endpoint of a planetary movement that has been unfolding beneath our feet for an almost unimaginable length of time. Rivers of darkness, how energy trickles down to the deepest floor. So now that we've arrived at this ultimate destination, this deep and persistent place at the end of Earth's long movements, we have to ask a quieter, more practical question. How does anything stay alive here at all? If no sunlight reaches Challenger Deep, if the surface might as well be another world entirely, what keeps even the smallest cell from simply running out of energy and falling silent? We often picture the ocean as bright blue water filled with darting fish and green drifting plants, all powered by the sun. But beneath that familiar surface, there is another kind of weather, one we do not see. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine standing in your mind, far above the trench, somewhere in the upper few hundred meters, where tiny plankton bloom and die, where larger animals feed and shed and release waste into the cold. Every day, from this busy sunlit layer, a slow blizzard begins. Scientists call it marine snow, but the name is almost too gentle for how important it is. Now, picture what happens to a single pale flake, a fragment of dead plankton, a grain of fecal matter, a sliver of broken tissue, all bound together with mucus and minerals, starting to sink. It drifts downward through kilometers of water, past fish that never see the sky, past the dark mid-water where strange, transparent bodies hang like lanterns, taking weeks or even months to fall those final thousands of meters toward the trench floor. Most of it is eaten along the way, grazed and shredded and recycled by animals and microbes that live in the deep, but not the deepest. Yet some fraction keeps going, thinner and more fragile, until it reaches the abyssal plains, and then the Haddle slopes, and finally the narrow gutter of Challenger Deep itself. Because the trench is not just a hole, it is a kind of collector. Sediments slump down its walls like very slow avalanches of mud. Currents creep along its axis, and together they funnel this faint snowfall into the lowest folds of the seafloor, concentrating food in a place that, paradoxically, may be richer than the flat open abyss around it. And falling snow is not the only river of energy here. In certain patches of the deep earth, methane can seep from buried sediments, hydrogen-rich fluids can leak from fractured rocks, and subtle chemical gradients appear where one kind of water meets another. Follow me into that idea. Microbes that never see light can tap these gradients the way plants tap sunlight, building tiny, hidden ecosystems that do not care whether the surface is day or night, summer or winter. So if energy does arrive, in drifting flakes and invisible chemical streams, and if life can shape itself to withstand 1,000 times the pressure we feel at sea level, what does that allow? Does it support only sparse, lonely microbes clinging to individual grains of sediment, or can whole communities rise and fall here on the rhythm of distant storms and long-ago blooms, like forests fed by a river they will never see? In the next part, we're going to follow that question all the way down and ask what kind of creatures might be waiting at the end of this almost imaginary rain. Life under 1,000 atmospheres, how cells refuse to be crushed. So, if a gentle rain of dead plankton really does fall into this trench for millions of years, what kind of bodies can meet it there and not be quietly destroyed in the dark? To feel that, make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because down here the familiar rules of being alive begin to bend in ways we almost never see at the surface. We often picture pressure as a simple squeezing, as if some invisible glacier of water were just pressing inward from every side. But what happens a full 11 kilometers beneath the waves is stranger and more intimate than that. High pressure reaches into the smallest spaces inside a cell. It nudges atoms closer together, changes how molecules bump and twist, and gently encourages delicate structures to come undone. Proteins that fold neatly into precise shapes at 1 atmosphere can begin to misfold or unravel. Chemical reactions that run easily in shallow seas can stall, and ordinary cell membranes can stiffen until they behave more like cold glass than living skin. Now, picture what happens if you are a microbe or a small crustacean trying to build a world inside that invisible vice. You cannot push the ocean back, so you change yourself instead. Many deep living organisms fill their cells with special small molecules, called piezolites, that act almost like tiny braces, holding proteins in their working shapes when pressure tries to pry them open. One of the most famous is TMAO, a compound that, in shallow fish, can give off a strong smell, but in hadal creatures becomes a quiet guardian, stabilizing enzymes, keeping them from collapsing into useless tangles even under 1,000 atmospheres. These same creatures rework their boundaries too. A typical membrane near the surface might be relatively tidy and rigid, but in the deep, that would be a liability, turning to something brittle under extreme pressure and low temperature. So trench-dwelling cells weave in more unsaturated fats, kinks in the long chains that stop them from packing too tightly. And the result is a flexible, almost softly flowing barrier that stays fluid and responsive in a place where ours would freeze into stillness. The cell, in a sense, remains a warm, moving world, even as the surrounding water presses with unimaginable force. On the scale of whole bodies, the same logic appears in different forms. Many hadal animals have reduced or more cartilaginous skeletons, trading heavy, rigid bone for bendable frameworks that can distribute pressure rather than crack beneath it. The ghostly snailfish found near trench bottoms, for instance, carries a thin, delicate skull and a body that seems to blur into the water around it, less like a rigid machine and more like a carefully tuned bag of living seawater. None of this is a quick fix. We're going to remind ourselves that these are not clever tricks invented in a single lifetime, but the slow, patient work of evolution, acting over millions of years while continents drift and climates change above. Generation after generation, tiny differences in membranes, in proteins, in skeletons decide who manages to reproduce in this cold, crushing place and who does not. Because somewhere below, at the very deepest point, these same principles may shape creatures we haven't yet seen, and to even guess what they might look like, we have to ask how far these adaptations can go. The known residents: snailfish, amphipods, and invisible microbes. So after all that slow, relentless filtering of life by cold and pressure, who has actually made it to the very bottom with us watching? We often picture the deep as completely empty, a blank, silent void beneath the waves. But when our cameras and baited traps finally touch the floor of Challenger Deep, a small cast of residents comes quietly into view. Follow me for a moment to one of those landers sitting in the dark like a tiny artificial glacier of metal and glass resting on soft sediment. Out of the blackness, the first shapes to arrive are often amphipods, small crustaceans that look a little like translucent shrimp, their bodies curved, their legs working busily as they pick over whatever we have offered them. They are scavengers, patient recyclers of anything that drifts down from the bright surface world above, from dead fish to fragments of plants, and even now, our own debris. Under the faint glow of deep-sea lights, their shells seem almost made of glass, pale and ghostly, as if the cold and the years and the immense pressure have thinned them down to the bare minimum needed to survive. Yet inside, their cells carry special molecules that help their proteins keep working where most life would simply fall apart, like delicate machinery crushed by a mountain of ice. They are fragile, and at the same time, astonishingly tough. A little farther up the slopes of the trench, in the hadal zone just above the very deepest point, we're going to meet one of the strangest vertebrates on Earth, the hadal snailfish. It does not look like the sleek predators we often picture when we think of deep-sea life. Instead, its body is soft and gelatinous, with thin bones and a face that seems almost unfinished, as if evolution decided that in this place, stiffness was a liability. Its tissues are filled with compounds that act like gentle supports for proteins and membranes, allowing nerves and muscles to function where many other fish can no longer survive. Beneath even these visible animals, and all around them, is a world of life too small for our cameras. In the sediments, in tiny films on rocks, and perhaps clinging to the bodies of amphipods and snailfish, bacteria and archaea work slowly through chemical reactions, using traces of organic matter or the minerals in the crust itself as their food. Down here, microbes are almost certainly the most abundant residents, forming a hidden foundation for whatever larger creatures manage to live above. And yet, even in these few known forms, we can already see our own reflection. When scientists analyzed amphipods from hadal trenches, they found industrial chemicals, like PCBs, once used in electrical equipment, concentrated in their tissues, and plastic fragments in their guts. Evidence that our waste has sunk all the way into this deep, cold place. Not because we meant it to, but because gravity and currents do not respect our boundaries. So if, in just a handful of brief visits, we have seen translucent scavengers, soft-bodied fish, and invisible microbial worlds, what else might be moving just beyond the reach of our lights? Too delicate for our traps, too small for our lenses, or so rare that we simply haven't been there at the right moment yet. Now, picture what happens when we try to stay long enough and gently enough to find out what we might be missing, fragile worlds beyond our cameras. When we try to stay long enough and gently enough to find out, we discover that even our patience has a kind of built-in bias. We often picture our cameras descending like quiet eyes into a still, obedient world, simply recording whatever happens to live there. But the truth is, the moment we arrive, we begin to choose what we see. Most of the images you've seen from Challenger Deep come from baited landers and traps, heavy frames lowered from ships, carrying lights, cameras, and a small bundle of food. A piece of fish, a block of compressed bait, something that smells like opportunity in the cold, black water. Naturally, the first to appear are scavengers, amphipods with translucent shells, sometimes snailfish drifting in from the dark, creatures whose whole existence is built around finding rare falls of food on the deep seafloor. So our record of this place is shaped, from the very start, by appetite, not because scientists are careless, but because at nearly 11,000 meters, under more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, it is one of the few reliable ways to coax life in front of a lens. We're going to notice the bold, the hungry, the ones that hurry. The quiet lives that do not rush toward a sudden feast may never pass through our field of view at all. Now, picture what happens when that lander touches the sediment. Bright lamps flare on, motors hum, metal settles into soft mud that has been undisturbed for perhaps years. Even in this world without sunlight, there are eyes, or at least light-sensitive cells, tuned to the faintest glow. A sudden white beam may be less a gentle invitation and more a blinding shock. How many delicate, transparent bodies fold themselves deeper into burrows, or simply stop moving, until the intrusion passes? The same is true for submersibles. Their hulls must resist unimaginable pressure, so they are heavy, solid, and rarely silent. Thrusters stir clouds of fine particles, the way a boot stirs dust on a dry road at the surface. To us, it feels like careful maneuvering. To a small, slow animal living just beneath the top layer of sediment, it may feel like a storm. Imagine the lives that never need to swim into open water at all. Tiny worms threading through pores between grains of sand, crustaceans no larger than a seed, organisms tucked into microscopic crevices of rock, or nestled inside thin, fuzzy layers of microbial mat. Their food may come not from falling carcasses, but from a slow rain of organic dust, from chemical gradients in the mud, from the steady work of bacteria breaking down compounds grain by grain. Beneath the visible seafloor, there is another kind of depth, layers of sediment, each a slightly different world. Near the surface, microbes that tolerate a little oxygen. Deeper down, others that breathe sulfate or methane or metals, turning invisible chemistry into the quiet energy of life. We can take a core, bring it up through kilometers of water, and slice it in the lab. But the moment we disturb those layers, the gradients blur, the communities mix, and the original structure is gone. In that sense, our view of Challenger Deep may be like shining a flashlight into a forest at night. The first things we notice are the eyes that reflect back, the animals bold enough to step into the beam. But the mosses on the logs, the insects under the bark, the roots threading through the soil, those remain mostly imagined. We see a handful of scavengers and a scattering of microbes and call it a world, while knowing, quietly, that it is probably only the brightest edge of something far more intricate. So as we watch those ghostly amphipods swirl around a baited frame, it helps to slow your thoughts and remember what is missing from the picture. Make yourself comfortable with the idea that most of this deep, cold place is still unlit, unbothered by our visits, and perhaps organized in ways we have not yet learned to recognize. Because if this is what we can glimpse in a few hours with noisy machines and narrow beams of light, what might we find if we could become smaller, softer, and stay for years instead of moments? We've touched the bottom, briefly, the Trieste and the first human visit, so to understand what it means to truly arrive in a place like this and yet barely touch it, we're going to step back in time and follow one of the strangest journeys humans have ever made. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine not a sleek modern submarine, but a metal capsule that looks almost improvised, dangling beneath the waves by cables and hope. This was the Bathyscaphe Trieste in January of 1960, drifting on the cold surface of the Pacific above the Mariana Trench. Beneath its white, float-like hull hung a thick steel sphere, barely large enough for two people to sit inside. Its walls so heavy and curved that they could just resist the enormous pressure waiting far below. Instead of elegant tanks, the upper hull was filled with gasoline, not for fuel, but for buoyancy, because gasoline is lighter than seawater and does not compress as easily under pressure. Inside that sphere were Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, knees almost touching, surrounded by dials and valves, peering out through tiny portholes of thick plexiglass toward a world they could not yet see. We often picture exploration as spacious and heroic, but this was cramped, quiet, and intensely vulnerable. For nearly 5 hours they sank, slowly, through layers of darkening water, leaving the sunlit surface far above like a memory. Now, picture what happens when the weight of almost 11 kilometers of water begins to press in. At around 9,000 meters, the calm was broken by a sharp cracking sound, like a branch snapping in a winter forest. But here there were no trees, only pressure. One of the outer plexiglass windows had fractured under the load. The inner sphere held, but the message was clear. The ocean was testing every weakness. Imagine sitting there after that sound, knowing that you cannot simply swim back to safety. They continued downward anyway. That decision alone tells us something about the particular courage, or perhaps stubbornness, that deep exploration demands. Finally, after hours of descent, Trieste settled into the soft sediment of Challenger Deep, a brief puff of mud rising around them like a slow-motion cloud, turning the already dim view into a pale drifting fog. They stayed only about 20 minutes. The seafloor appeared flat and gently rippled, more like a desert than a dramatic abyss. Visibility was poor. The stirred-up sediment clung to the water, erasing distance. Through their small windows, they thought they saw a flatfish, perhaps a kind of sole, though later work would cast doubt on whether such animals can truly live under that much pressure. There were no long walks, no careful sampling of hidden communities, almost no biological material collected at all. And yet, when Trieste rose back toward the light, newspapers around the world announced that humans had reached the deepest point on Earth. Not the whole deep, of course. Just one tiny contact point, one footprint in an immense cold room. For all the effort, all the risk, and all the wonder of that dive, what we actually learned about life and chemistry and motion at the bottom was astonishingly small. It's a paradox that will follow us through the rest of this journey. We can touch the edge of this hidden world, briefly and at great cost, but we cannot yet stay. In the next part, we'll slow your thoughts again and look at how, even with modern machines and quieter lights, most of Challenger Deep still slips away from our instruments, as if the Earth were gently closing its hand around its deepest secret. Snapshots, not stories, why our visits are so short and rare. So when we say we can touch the edge of that hidden world but not stay, we mean it quite literally, in hours and minutes, not in seasons or years. We often picture an expedition to the deepest place on Earth as something steady and lingering, a calm hovering over the seafloor where we simply watch and wait. But the reality is closer to a single slow breath held at the very limit of what our bodies and our machines can endure. Imagine we're inside one of those rare crude vessels, the Trieste in 1960, James Cameron's slender deep-sea Challenger in 2012, or the compact titanium sphere of the DSV limiting factor more recently. We make ourselves comfortable as best we can in a cramped, cold interior, wrapped in a thick pressure hull that must not fail, because outside, the water will eventually reach more than 1,000 times the pressure at the surface. Just the descent alone can take 2, 3, even 4 hours of sinking through the dark, and every minute the batteries drain and the safety margins narrow. Now, picture what happens at the bottom. After this long fall through the water column, the pilots finally see the silt of Challenger Deep rise up in the lights, and yet their time there is painfully short, often just a few hours before the long climb back begins. In that narrow window, they must navigate without GPS, choose where to land, collect samples, film, and still keep constant watch on life support, power, and the structural health of the sub. Every decision to linger over an animal or a rock means not doing something else. There is no leisurely wandering across this abyssal plain. The reason is written into the engineering itself. To keep 3 people alive under that kind of pressure, you need a hull so thick and strong it becomes a dense metal world all its own, surrounded by flotation, batteries, life support systems, and layers of redundancy. Not because anyone is being overly cautious, but because down here a single failure is final. That makes these submersibles heavy, complex, and extremely expensive to design, build, and operate, like tiny deep-sea spacecraft that can only fly a handful of missions. Across more than 60 years, only a small number of such dives have reached Challenger Deep, and fewer people have sat on its floor than have walked on the moon. Our data from this place is not a continuous documentary of life beneath the waves, but a scattered handful of photographs, a few hours from Trieste, a few from Deep-Sea Challenger, a few more from Limiting Factor, each framed by long, silent ascents and descents where we can only pass through. We're going to keep returning, but for now, these visits remain brief, fragile, and rare. So if humans cannot easily stay, we might ask, can we send machines to keep watch for us instead, to turn snapshots into stories? Follow me, because the deep has quiet, patient ways of breaking those as well. When the deep fights back, the implosion of Nereus. So when we say the deep can break our machines, we're not speaking in metaphors or distant possibilities. We're talking about very real losses, carefully built and lovingly tested, that vanish in an instant into the cold, black water beneath the surface. Follow me to one of those stories. In 2009, a slender, almost delicate-looking craft called Nereus slipped down into Challenger Deep and touched the seafloor nearly 11 kilometers below. And for a moment, it felt as though we had finally built a quiet envoy that could live, at least briefly, in that other world. It was celebrated as a breakthrough, not just for reaching the deepest point, but for doing so with a grace that seemed to match the stillness of the trench itself. Nereus was a hybrid remotely operated vehicle, which means it could behave like a tethered robot on a leash of fiber optic cable, or like a free-swimming explorer when that leash became a limitation, and this flexibility was part of what made it so remarkable. Instead of relying on giant metal floats, it carried hundreds of small white ceramic spheres inside its frame, each carefully engineered to resist crushing, together providing the buoyancy it needed to rise back through the dark. Around them, advanced electronics, cameras, and sensors were tucked into pressure-resistant housings, all arranged like organs in a body designed for one purpose: to go where almost nothing else built by human hands could go. Now, picture what happens when that quiet balance fails. In 2014, Nereus descended again, this time not into the Mariana Trench, but into the Kermadec Trench in the southwest Pacific, another narrow wound in the seafloor that reaches almost 10,000 meters deep. Hours into the dive, contact was suddenly lost. There was no dramatic signal, no long goodbye, just silence. And later, a small scattering of fragments found floating at the surface. all that remained after an implosion. An implosion at that depth is not simply a crack or a leak. It is the entire structure giving way inward as the outside pressure overwhelms every bolt, sphere, and seal. And the water rushes in so fast that it releases as much energy as a small explosion, only turned inside out. Imagine a space that had been carefully held open against the weight of 1,000 atmospheres, suddenly erased, the surrounding ocean closing that emptiness in a fraction of a second. There is no time to react. There is barely time to exist. For Nereus, this meant that even our best understanding of materials, our most cautious testing, and our years of experience with the deep were still not enough. Not because the engineers were careless, but because the Hadal Zone pushes every design to its edge, and then a little farther, in a way that feels almost like resistance. We often picture the ocean floor as a stable, quiet place just waiting for us. But here it is more like a shifting boundary, where earth, water, and pressure conspire to unmake what we send. So when we dream about leaving long-term observatories down there, patient instruments that could watch for years and show us how life and geology move in the dark, Nereus stands as a quiet warning. The deep does not just ask us to arrive, it demands that we survive. And to understand why that is so hard, we're going to have to look more closely at what this pressure actually does to matter, and why the creatures that endure it are so different from anything we build. Why pressure wins, the limits of metals, glass, and human materials. Down at Challenger Deep, the enemy isn't some dramatic monster in the dark. It's something we live with every day, something so ordinary, we almost forget it exists. It's pressure itself, taken to such an extreme that the materials we trust on the surface begin to behave in strange, almost unsettling ways. We often picture steel as solid and unyielding, glass as rigid and clear, plastics as quietly dependable, wrapped around our wires and electronics. Now, picture what happens when all of that is carried almost 11 kilometers beneath the waves, into a cold, silent place where the weight above is more than 1,000 atmospheres. Every tiny flaw in a weld, every microscopic crack in a window, every bubble in a molded part becomes a weak point, a place where the deep can concentrate its force and patiently push until something gives. To fight back, we thicken the walls. A pressure hull of titanium or steel grows heavier, denser, more like a small piece of the Earth's crust than a vehicle. That extra thickness does help it survive, but it also means we need larger ships to carry it, stronger cables to lower it, more fuel to move it through the water. Costs rise, mobility falls, and the very thing that keeps us safe begins to limit where we can go and how often we can return. At some point, adding more metal stops being a solution and becomes its own problem. The weak spots are often not the grand, obvious structures, but the quiet details at the edges. Seals, cables, and connectors, the parts that let power and information cross the boundary between inside and outside, are especially vulnerable. Under that immense pressure, water is not just a liquid. It behaves almost like a slow, relentless tool forced into microscopic gaps in rubber and plastic, crushing insulation, bending pins, and shorting out circuits that looked perfect in the lab. A single droplet where it shouldn't be can end a mission that took years to plan. Even our most pressure-resistant shapes are not as invincible as we might hope. Ceramic spheres, carefully made to float and endure the deep, can still fail if there is a hidden defect, a slightly uneven thickness, a tiny scratch that focuses stress the way a lens focuses light. Testing every component at full ocean depth is possible only in a few facilities, and even then it is slow, expensive, and never fully guarantees how something will behave after days or months in the real trench. So when we talk about the world beneath Challenger Deep, we're not just talking about a place we haven't visited enough. We're talking about a realm that pushes the edge of what our metals, our glass, our cables, and our imagination can endure. As we make yourself comfortable with that thought and slow your thoughts a little, Follow me into the next question. How does life manage what our finest engineering still struggles to do? Listening from above, how we sense the deep without touching it. So if life somehow endures what our metals and glass can barely survive, how do we even begin to sense it from so far above? We're going to stay at the surface for a moment now, in the thin, bright skin of the ocean, and listen downward into that cold, crushing dark instead of trying to force our way inside. From ships that drift miles above Challenger Deep, we send out fans of sound, multi-beam sonar that sweeps the seafloor the way a lighthouse sweeps the shore, timing how long each pulse takes to bounce back from the trench walls and the hidden plain below. From space, satellites trace tiny rises and falls in the ocean's surface, where Earth's gravity tugs a little harder over a buried seamount, or a little less above the great hollow of the trench, letting us sketch the shape of the deep without ever touching it. It's a kind of remote fingertip pressed very gently against the skin of the sea. These tools have given us a rough silhouette of the Mariana Trench, its long, narrow scar in the seafloor, and the small ridges and bumps nearby. And they've shown us where Challenger Deep dips to nearly 11 kilometers. But they cannot show us the fine wrinkles of that world, the tiny ledges where a film of microbes might grow, the scattered pebbles that shelter amphipods, the delicate mounds of sediment that a slow current has been building for years. We often picture a perfectly smooth abyssal plain. What we actually have is a blurred outline, like seeing a mountain range only as a shadow through fog. So oceanographers learn to infer, to read clues in the water itself. They lower instruments that record temperature, salinity, and the faint signatures of chemicals as they sink and rise again, never quite reaching the bottom, but passing through layers that have been in contact with it. Now, picture what happens when a cold, dense current spills down the trench wall, or when a pulse of muddy sediment rushes along the floor. Traces of that motion, a slight change in heat, a hint of methane or other dissolved gases from a seep, drift upward, carrying news from beneath. It's like hearing muffled sounds through a wall. We can tell that something is moving down there, that the pressure shifts, that there are soft crashes and slow flows, and perhaps the quiet work of life. But we can't see the faces, or the gestures, or the tiny negotiations between predator and prey. We can map a trench, sense a current, guess at a seep. We cannot yet watch a single creature live out its deep, dark day. So we know just enough to be certain that Challenger Deep is not empty, and not simple, yet not nearly enough to say who truly lives there, or how their hidden world is built. To learn that, we would need to be there, quietly, for a long time, with instruments that can endure the pressure and simply wait. And that is exactly what this place resists. Because the moment we try to stay, something strange begins to happen in the dark. One of Earth's hardest engineering problems, hiding underwater. Because the moment we try to stay, something strange begins to happen in the dark. And this is where Challenger Deep stops feeling like a simple destination, and starts to look more like one of the hardest engineering problems on Earth, hiding quietly underwater while we stand on the surface and wonder how to reach it. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts. We often picture great engineering challenges as rockets leaving the planet, icebreakers forcing their way through polar ice, or drills biting into hot volcanic rock. But here, the difficulty is not fire or emptiness. It is a cold, heavy, invisible weight that presses from every direction, a patient pressure that never lets up, even for a second. At nearly 11 kilometers down, every square centimeter of a hull, of a cable, of a tiny sensor, feels more than 1,000 times the pressure at the surface. Space, in comparison, is a vacuum that tries to pull things apart. The deep ocean is a world that tries to squeeze them inward, like a giant, silent fist closing around metal, glass, and plastic. Now picture what happens when we ask a delicate scientific instrument not just to survive that descent, but to live there for months or years, quietly recording, storing, and sending us whispers of data through all that water. we're going to notice that it is not enough to build one strong shell and call it done. Every single part has to be reimagined for this hidden place. Batteries must keep their charge when chemistry itself changes under pressure. Sensors must keep responding when their crystals and membranes are being compressed. Housings, seals, and cables cannot have even the smallest weakness, because the ocean will find it patiently, molecule by molecule. A single connector that is not truly pressure tolerant can fail long before the main hull does, turning a beautiful observatory into a silent rock on the seafloor. And then there is the problem of distance. How do we talk to something that far beneath us? Radio waves fade quickly in seawater, so our messages must travel through long cables or as faint acoustic pulses that creep upward through 11 kilometers of cold. Any power we send has to make the same journey. If the cable snaps, the instrument is gone. If the batteries run out, the world it was watching becomes invisible to us again. Right now, our technology lets us visit Challenger Deep the way climbers might camp briefly on the slopes of Everest. A quick arrival, a few careful measurements, a few hours of breathless observation, and then a retreat to safety. But what we truly need is more like a permanent, self-sustaining village at the summit, a small, enduring presence in that crushing dark. What would it take to build something that could stay and watch and endure when even our strongest machines still tremble at the edge of that pressure? In the next part, we'll follow that question down into the designs that almost work, and the quiet ways the deep still breaks them. When the seafloor moves, shifting sediments, quakes, and landslides. So we have this dream of a quiet village on the abyssal plain, a little cluster of instruments keeping watch in the darkness for years at a time. It feels solid in our minds, almost peaceful, as if the seafloor were a still, flat field where we could simply set things down and walk away. But the world beneath Challenger Deep is not a calm field. It moves. We often picture a trench as a static bowl of mud, a deep, cold groove in the Earth's crust where everything has already settled. In reality, a trench is more like the steep front yard of a grinding machine, where one tectonic plate is forced down beneath another, and the edge of that upper plate is scraped, bent, and shaken. Sediments rain down from the slopes, they slump and creep, and sometimes, when an earthquake runs along the subduction zone, they suddenly let go and rush downward as underwater landslides. Now, picture what happens to anything we place on that unstable floor. A carefully designed lander can sit there for months, quietly measuring pressure, chemistry, and the faint movements of the water. Then a distant quake, perhaps hundreds of kilometers away, sends a pulse through the rock. A slope fails. A dense, muddy flow surges along the trench axis, and in a few minutes, the lander is no longer a neat tower of instruments in open water, but a buried lump under meters of fresh sediment. Sometimes the change is not sudden at all. Even without dramatic slides, a slow drizzle of fine particles from the surface ocean settles through the deep water year after year, like a constant silent snowfall in the dark. Cables that once lay on top of the seafloor are gradually swallowed. Sensors designed to taste the water are entombed in mud, cut off from the very world they were meant to measure. Surfaces that needed to stay exposed become sealed away, their readings slowly drifting from reality as the environment around them changes. Because of this, we're going to think not only about pressure, but about motion. An observatory here cannot just resist being crushed. It has to survive being shaken, tilted, buried, and perhaps dragged. That means heavier frames, deeper anchors, sacrificial towers that can snap off without tearing out their cables, and backup sensors perched higher above the seafloor in case the lower ones disappear. Each extra layer of protection adds weight, complexity, and cost, until our simple idea of a seafloor village starts to look more like a fortified outpost clinging to a cliff. If you slow your thoughts for a moment and imagine the budgets behind these designs, you can feel another kind of pressure building. To harden instruments against landslides, To accept that some will be lost is to spend large sums on things we may never see again in a place most of us will never visit or directly use. And that leads us toward a quieter, more human barrier than rock or water. Not what we can build, but how we choose to value and to fund a hidden deep world that exists mostly in our imagination. Make yourself comfortable, because that barrier is harder to map than any trench wall. And in the next part, we'll follow it into the way our stories, our priorities, and our fears decide where we dare to explore. A quiet check-in, you, the night, and an invisible abyss. So before we follow that barrier any further, let's pause here for a moment with you and the night and this invisible abyss we've been circling in our minds. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are, and just notice how your body feels now compared to when we first mentioned that cold trench at the edge of the world. Maybe your shoulders have sunk a little closer to the mattress or the chair, as if they too have slipped a few kilometers beneath the surface. Maybe your breathing is slower, and your thoughts have started to stretch out, like long, gentle waves that take years to cross an ocean. It's a small thing, but in a way you've been descending with us, letting the weight of all that water and pressure turn into a kind of quiet. We often picture Challenger Deep as something distant and abstract, just a number on a diagram, 10 or 11,000 meters, a sharp notch in a blue map. But imagine it again now as an alien world at the bottom of our own planet. A place where sunlight never arrives, where the weight above is more than 1,000 times what you feel at sea level, and where anything alive has to be built from the molecules up to endure that crushing force. We've talked about how that deep cut in the seafloor formed, not by a sudden wound, but by plates of the earth slowly sliding, one sinking beneath another, over millions of years. We've let our minds rest on the sheer pressure there, enough to turn metal soft and to snap most machines if they fail. We've met the small, resilient lives that have shown themselves at those depths. Pale amphipods, ghost-like snailfish, films of microbes coating rocks and sediment, all quietly proving that biology can bend around rules we thought were fixed. And we've traced the limits of what we can build. Submersibles that can visit but not linger, sensors that work for hours or days but rarely for seasons, cables and housings that fatigue and crack under constant stress, not because we lack imagination, but because the deep earth and the deep ocean set conditions that our materials, our power systems, and our budgets can only briefly match. If some of those details are already starting to blur together, that's all right. You don't need to remember exact depths or model names or dates. The point is not to carry a list of facts, but to feel the scale and strangeness of this hidden place, to hold in your mind that there is a world beneath the waves that is as remote, in practice, as another planet. Pattern interrupt. Imagine, just for a second, that someone knocked on your door tomorrow with a clear jar holding a creature from Challenger Deep, alive, glowing faintly in your living room light. How different would our sense of Earth be if we could simply look at it whenever we wished? We can't do that, of course, so we're going to take a softer path. Follow me a little longer as we turn away from this unreachable trench and toward other extremes we can reach more easily. Boiling vents, polar ice, and subglacial lakes, places where we can watch life adapt, and from those glimpses, begin to guess what might be happening in the deepest dark we may never truly see. Learning from other extremes, hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, and watch its hidden world unfold, we turn, instead, to other edges of the ocean where the curtain is pulled back just a little. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine we're drifting away from that narrow trench, rising through the dark water and then sinking again, somewhere else along the vast spine of the Earth. Far from any ice or glacier, along mid-ocean ridges where tectonic plates pull apart, the seafloor cracks open, and hot fluids rush out. We often picture the deep sea as empty and still, but here the water boils with minerals, and tall chimneys of rock grow like forests turned to smoke. These are hydrothermal vents, sometimes called black smokers, because they pour out dark, particle-rich plumes that look like underwater fire without flame. Now, picture what happens around those chimneys. In the cold, high-pressure darkness, where sunlight never reaches the surface, whole communities gather. Giant tube worms with blood-red plumes, ghostly white crabs, strange shrimp and snails, all clustered around the hot, chemical-rich water. Instead of feeding on plants that captured light, they rely on microbes that feed on chemistry itself, turning hydrogen sulfide and other compounds into the base of a food web that has never seen the sun. Follow me a little farther, and we arrive at a quieter kind of oasis, where the seafloor does not roar with heat but simply seeps. At cold seeps, methane and other hydrocarbons leak slowly from the sediments beneath, forming gentle streams of energy in a place that feels almost frozen in time. Here, clams and mussels bury into the mud, tube worms anchor themselves like pale grasses, and inside their tissues, symbiotic microbes process those chemicals the way leaves process light. These places are not as deep as Challenger Deep, not pressed under quite the same immense weight of water, but they teach us something profound. Life can weave complex layered worlds around chemical gradients alone, building entire ecosystems in the dark, independent of photosynthesis, patient over years and centuries. If that can happen at a vent or a seep, what might unfold in the even more compressed silence of a trench floor? We're going to take that lesson and gently extend it. If there are pockets of methane trapped in the sediments of the Mariana Trench, or slow, hydrogen-rich fluids rising from deeper rock, then microscopic communities could be there too, harvesting those tiny differences in chemistry. Not dramatic gardens of worms, perhaps, but thin films of bacteria, buried mats, or delicate colonies living inside the very grains of sediment, almost invisible, yet persistent. And yet, these are only analogies, guides rather than guarantees. Challenger Deep may echo the patterns we see at vents and seeps, or it may be stranger and more minimal than we dare to imagine, a world pared down by pressure and time. To move closer to that mystery, we have to look at the few, fragile clues we've already managed to bring back from the dark. Lake Vostok beneath the ice, a hidden world we've barely touched. Those clues don't only come from the ocean, sometimes they're locked away in ice. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and follow me far from the warm seas and the shifting waves to a place that almost never changes at the surface, but hides an entire world beneath. We're going to the middle of East Antarctica, to a flat white emptiness where the air is thin and bitterly cold, and where the ice is nearly 4 kilometers thick. Beneath that frozen weight lies Lake Vostok, a vast body of fresh water sealed away from the open air for hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years. It is longer than some of our great earthly lakes, held under enormous pressure, buried in darkness, separated from wind and sunlight and seasons. We often picture a lake as something you can stand beside and see, with waves and reflections and sky. Lake Vostok has none of that. It is a hidden, liquid space, trapped under the slow, crushing mass of a glacier. That's what a glacier is at this scale. Not just ice on rock, but ice over water, ice over entire landscapes. For a long time, no one knew it was there. The first signs were whispers in the data, radar pulses sent down through the ice that bounced back too smoothly, too brightly, as if they had struck a mirror rather than rough frozen crystals. Satellite measurements showed tiny changes in the height of the ice sheet, rising and falling over years, as if something beneath it were breathing. From these echoes and subtle motions, scientists inferred a lake long before they ever touched a drop of its water. Now, picture what happens when we try to reach such a place. We cannot simply melt a hole and plunge in, because every tool we send down carries microbes from our own world at the surface. A single modern cell, out of place, could bloom and overrun a fragile ancient ecosystem before we even realize it exists. So the drilling systems at Vostok were designed with almost ritual care. Filtered fluids, sterilized components, procedures meant to keep the lake as untouched as possible. Even with that, true contact has been brief, almost like brushing fingertips through a keyhole. In the ice that refroze from that contact, researchers have reported traces of microbial life, genetic signatures that suggest small, persistent communities surviving without direct sunlight, perhaps feeding on chemicals from rock and ice instead of on light. A cold, pressurized, dark world, yet still alive. Lake Vostok becomes a kind of mirror for Challenger Deep, a realm we know is there, that we can model and partially sample, but that remains largely unseen in its natural state. If it is this hard to gently open a lake beneath 4 kilometers of ice, what does that tell us about a trench nearly 11 kilometers deep beneath the sea? In both places, the question is the same. How do we look inside a hidden world without breaking it? To move from ice back to ocean, we have to carry that question with us. Europa, Enceladus, and the deep, practicing for alien oceans at home. To move from ice back to ocean, we have to carry that question with us and let it widen a little. Because somewhere else in the solar system, the same question is waiting under a different kind of frozen roof. So make yourself comfortable and follow me a little farther from home while we stay very close to the idea of a hidden, pressurized world beneath a cold surface. We often picture oceans as something that belongs only to Earth, spreading under blue skies and broken by waves and wind. Yet out near Jupiter and Saturn, there are moons where the water never sees starlight at all. Europa, wrapped in a shell of ice perhaps tens of kilometers thick, is thought to hide a global ocean touching a rocky seafloor. Enceladus, smaller and colder, sprays salty plumes into space from fractures in its own frozen crust. Now, picture what happens when we realize that these are not just icy rocks, but whole deep seas, sealed away for billions of years. If life exists there, it will not bask in sunlight, it will not grow in gentle shallows. It will live, if it lives, the way some of our deepest organisms do, far beneath the surface, feeding on chemical gradients instead of light. On Earth, at hydrothermal vents and along the dark floor of trenches, microbes and strange animals build ecosystems, powered by reactions between hot rock and cold seawater, enduring pressures hundreds or thousands of times what we feel at sea level. When we look at Europa's buried ocean, or imagine Enceladus's seafloor, we are really extending those same deep communities outward, asking whether chemistry alone can sustain a world. To reach those alien oceans, scientists sketch out tools that sound almost like science fiction, yet they echo what we already struggle to build for Challenger Deep. We're going to need autonomous probes that can think for themselves when radio signals take hours to arrive, melt-through landers that can slowly descend through ice, the way hot water drills move through a glacier, and long-lived observatories resting quietly on a distant seafloor. Each of those ideas has a twin here: a robot left for years in the trench, a cable that survives crushing pressure, a small laboratory that watches the deep instead of just visiting it. And here is the gentle irony. We dream of sending these machines across hundreds of millions of kilometers through vacuum and radiation to taste the spray of Enceladus or listen to the shifting ice of Europa, while we still cannot keep a simple, permanent observatory alive at the bottom of our own ocean. Not because we lack imagination, but because the Earth itself, in its deepest places, remains hard to hold on to. So Challenger Deep becomes two things at once: an unanswered mystery in its own right, and a kind of training ground for the questions we will someday whisper beneath alien ice. If we can barely anchor instruments 11 kilometers down on Earth, what will it take to anchor them in a sea we can never visit in person? And what happens to our plans for Europa and Enceladus if the next attempt to watch Challenger Deep simply disappears into the dark? Why we haven't built a permanent window into the deepest dark, so when we ask what it would take to stop losing instruments into that darkness, to build not a brief visitor, but a permanent window at the bottom of Challenger Deep, we're really asking something even larger about how we explore. We're going to stay with that question for a moment. Make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts, because the answer is not only about metal and cables, but about time, money, and what we choose to care about on this restless Earth. Imagine trying to keep a small, delicate observatory alive under more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, in a cold, silent place almost 11 kilometers beneath the surface. Not just for a few hours or a single triumphant dive, but for years. The engineering alone would demand new alloys, new power systems, new ways of sending data up through the water without losing it to storms or failure. But that is only the first layer, because once we've solved the physics, we meet the reality of budgets and attention spans. A true long-term observatory at Challenger Deep would require not just a burst of funding for a spectacular expedition, but patient support over decades. Ships, crews, maintenance dives, spare parts built to survive pressures that turn most vessels into crumpled foil. Research agencies, facing limited resources, often turn instead to places where each dollar buys more data, more quickly. We often picture exploration as a heroic charge toward the most extreme frontier, yet the day-to-day choices are quieter and more pragmatic. A satellite in orbit can scan the whole planet's climate every day. A network of buoys in shallower ocean can track warming and currents that affect millions of people. Against that, a single, exquisitely difficult station in one trench, far beneath the waves, can look like a luxury. And the deep ocean, especially this deepest point, has a visibility problem. It is out of sight, out of reach, and not a place where any of us will ever live. Space missions promise images of glowing nebulae and distant worlds. Climate research speaks directly to storms, crops, and coasts. The hidden floor of the Mariana Trench, by contrast, offers no easy photographs, only grainy shapes in the dark and slow streams of numbers. How do we argue for it, gently but firmly, when there are so many urgent needs at the surface? Then there are the logistics that do not fit neatly into a proposal form. To deploy or repair anything at 11,000 meters, we need specialized ships that exist in very small numbers, rare weather windows in a rough Pacific, and international coordination over who controls which patch of sea. Now, picture what happens when something breaks. We cannot simply send a technician down a ladder. Each repair is another full expedition, another gamble that the trench will give our machines back. Yet if we could build that window, a quiet camera, a patient array of sensors listening year after year at the very bottom, what might we see that a single dive can never show us? Slow migrations of deep creatures following invisible chemical trails, faint earthquakes reshaping the trench floor, pulses of organic snow drifting down from storms we felt as mere rain. Somewhere in that continuous record might be patterns we do not yet know how to imagine. In the next section, we'll follow that possibility further and ask what kinds of lives might be unfolding down there right now, unwitnessed, in the longest night on Earth. Autonomous landers and freefall probes, our robotic messengers. So if we dream of that continuous record, of a patient eye watching the trench for years, we have to begin with what we actually have now. Not permanent seafloor laboratories, not yet, but brief mechanical visitors that drop out of the light and then hurry back home. In a way, they are like messages in bottles that we throw into the darkest water on Earth, hoping they will drift back to us. These are the freefall landers. Imagine a simple metal frame, carefully balanced, carrying cameras, cold-resistant batteries, bright lamps, and sometimes a small trap filled with bait. Heavy weights are bolted to the bottom. There is no engine, no propeller, just gravity and water and time. The ship releases it, the ocean takes hold, and under that growing pressure it sinks, slowly at first and then faster, until it disappears beneath the last trace of surface color. Now, picture what happens on the way down. For hours, the lander is falling through a world with almost no reference points, past drifting snowflakes of organic matter, past layers of water that get colder and denser, until at nearly 11,000 meters, the frame touches the seafloor with a soft, careful impact. Lights come on, cameras begin to watch. The bait begins to leak its scent into the longest night on Earth. We often picture the bottom of Challenger Deep as empty, but the images from these landers tell a different story. Amphipods, those small translucent crustaceans, gather in dense swarms around the bait, their bodies adapted to pressures that would crush a submarine hull. In some trenches, delicate snailfish glide into view, pale and soft, their bones reduced, their cells filled with special molecules that help them endure the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. From a few hours of footage and a few traps, we have pulled up specimens filled with microplastics and industrial chemicals, proof that even this hidden place is connected to our surface world. Yet these robotic messengers are brief guests. Their batteries are limited, their memory cards small, their housings strained by every minute they spend under such pressure. After a short vigil, a timer releases the heavy ballast, and small flotation spheres begin the long climb back toward the ship. Each lander is essentially a one-off visit, a single snapshot rather than a continuous film. We get moments, not seasons, glimpses, not lives, because somewhere beneath us, patterns are unfolding that require years to see. To follow them, scientists imagine more ambitious tools, long-lived observatories resting gently on the trench floor, or even cables carrying power and data all the way from the surface, turning Challenger Deep into a node in Earth's observing network. In theory, such systems could send real-time video, measure tiny earthquakes, listen for distant whale calls refracted down into the abyss. But in practice, building something that can sit calmly under that crushing pressure for a decade, resist corrosion, survive storms tugging at any cable from above, and still whisper data back through 11 kilometers of moving water, remains an unsolved challenge. So for now, make yourself comfortable with the idea that our view will stay fragmentary, a scattering of brief visits stitched together in our imagination. As we move on, we're going to ask what kind of community might be living down there between those visits, in the long intervals when no human eye and no robotic lens is watching at all. If we could watch for a year, imagining a time-lapse of the abyss, so let's take that fragmentary view, and just for a while, slow your thoughts even further. Follow me into an experiment that exists only in our minds for now. We're going to cheat the limits of our technology and the weight of all that water, and leave something behind at the very bottom. Imagine a pressure-proof camera and a small suite of quiet instruments, lowered gently until they settle into the soft sediment of Challenger Deep, nearly 11 kilometers beneath the surface. No bright searchlights, no noisy thrusters, just a dim amber glow that barely reaches an arm's length into the cold. Then the lights fade even more, to protect whatever lives there, and the machine simply waits. An entire year passes, and it never blinks. At first, in our time-lapse, almost nothing seems to happen. The frame is filled with a slow, constant snowfall of tiny white flecks, marine snow drifting down from the world of waves and storms far above. We often picture the deep sea as empty, but here the water is thick with this invisible weather, particles of dead plankton, fragments of shells, and scraps of carbon-rich dust that have taken weeks to fall through the dark. They settle in a thin veil over the sea floor, a quiet record of everything that has lived and died in the sunlit ocean. Now, picture what happens when that gentle fall is interrupted. Perhaps months into the recording, the camera suddenly sees a hazy wall roll past, an underwater blizzard, as an avalanche of sediment tumbles down from higher ledges of the trench. The scene turns cloudy, then clears again, revealing new ripples carved into the mud. In the middle of this, small scavengers arrive and depart, translucent amphipods hopping like ghostly insects. A sea cucumber inching along maybe, if we are lucky, the pale curve of a snailfish slipping through the beam and vanishing beyond it. Across the year, the rhythm would change. After a spring bloom at the surface, a thicker pulse of organic matter might rain down weeks later, a brief feast in a place that usually starves. Distant storms could send pressure waves through the water column, stirring the sediment just enough for our senses to notice. Even earthquakes, thousands of meters of rock away, might leave a subtle signature, a shiver in the mud, a tilt of the camera, a puff of cloudy grains rising and then settling back, like shaken snow. Most of the real drama, though, would stay invisible to the lens. Chemical sensors might show tiny surges of methane or other dissolved compounds as buried pockets leak and fade. DNA samplers could record microbial communities blooming and declining in response. Whole microscopic ecosystems rising and falling in cycles of days, weeks, and years. In this way, the deepest trench would resemble a glacier's hidden base or a subglacial lake, a place where life reshapes its world grain by grain, molecule by molecule, in patient darkness. For now, this year-long time-lapse is still only a thought experiment, a story we trace in careful lines but cannot yet ink in. Until we can build something that truly endures that pressure and that cold, what lives and happens at Challenger Deep will remain a sketch, a world outlined in pencil. And the real question is, when we finally manage to watch continuously, will the abyss behave the way we've imagined, or will it show us something we're not remotely prepared for? Ethics in the dark. Should we disturb what we can barely reach? If the abyss does show us something we're not prepared for, we have to pause and ask a quieter question. Should we even be there as much as we dream of being there? Before we rush to fill in that pencil sketch with ink and color, we might need to slow your thoughts and consider what it means to press machines, lights, and metal into a place that has known only darkness and pressure for millions of years. We often picture exploration as harmless curiosity, as if cameras and robots leave no footprints, but at nearly 11 kilometers down, even a small disturbance can matter. The animals and microbes beneath us live in a world where night is permanent, where the only sounds are distant rumbles and the slow rain of organic dust from above. Now, picture what happens when we lower a lander that hums, flashes, settles into the sediment, and stirs up a cloud that may take hours or days to fall back. We're going to send instruments, of course, because we want to know who lives there and how they endure that crushing pressure. Yet every bolt, every cable, every drop of hydraulic fluid is a potential intruder. A single surface microbe that survives the journey, a thin film of oil, a flake of paint, can become an alien arrival in an ecosystem that has been sealed away on geological timescales. In a cold, slow world, even a tiny contamination may not fade quickly. It may linger for years, woven into food webs we barely understand. And here is the pattern interrupt. Even before we truly arrived, we already left our mark. Expeditions have found plastic debris on the trench floor and tiny fragments of our packaging and clothing inside Hadal amphipods. Industrial chemicals, the kind we release into the air and water near the surface, have been measured in organisms from these depths. Without trying, without planning, we have already threaded our waste into the deepest part of the ocean. So we face an uncomfortable balance between knowledge and preservation. On one side is the immense value of understanding this hidden community, which might teach us how life copes with extreme pressure and endless night, and might even guide how we search for life in the ice-covered oceans of other worlds. On the other side is a responsibility not to turn Challenger Deep into just another place on Earth, shaped mainly by us. Imagine that part of respecting the trench is accepting that some questions will stay unanswered, that some mysteries will remain intact beneath the waves. To leave a corner of the planet only lightly touched, to make yourself comfortable with not knowing everything, might be a kind of restraint we rarely practice. And as we think about future dives, we'll have to decide how much ignorance we are willing to keep, and how carefully we can move if we choose to go deeper still. A second look at the mystery. What lives there, really? So after all this talk of limits and restraint, we should pause and come back to the question that brought us here in the first place. What actually lives down there, in that cold, hidden world beneath the waves of Challenger Deep? If we slow your thoughts for a moment and just hold that question gently, it becomes almost more mysterious, not less, the more we learn. We often picture the bottom of the deepest trench as a kind of underwater desert, a flat, lifeless plain pressed under impossible weight. But the reality, as far as our brief visits can tell, is quieter and more intricate than that. Down at nearly 11 kilometers, the pressure is more than 1,000 times what you feel at the surface. The temperature hovers just above freezing. There is no sunlight at all, and food falls from the upper ocean only in thin, intermittent showers of organic dust. It is not an easy place to be alive. And yet, life is there. We're going to return to some of the inhabitants we've already met, just to see them again with clearer eyes. Tiny microbes live in the mud and in the water itself, building their lives on chemistry rather than light, using dissolved compounds the way plants use sunshine. Amphipods, those small shrimp-like creatures, move slowly over the sediment, their bodies reinforced with special molecules that help their cell membranes and proteins keep working under crushing pressure. Even snailfish, delicate and almost translucent, have been found in the trench's upper reaches, with flexible bones, unique fats and pressure-loving enzymes that would fall apart in the gentler conditions near the surface. Now, picture what happens when we take those clues and stretch them a little, carefully, into the dark. If microbes can survive almost everywhere we look, is it so hard to imagine denser, more complex microbial mats coating certain patches of seafloor, turning chemical gradients into thin living carpets? Where a tiny trickle of methane or other gases rises from the sediment, there could be slow, symbiotic partnerships between bacteria and small invertebrates, echoing the communities we see around shallower cold seeps, but adapted to this far deeper, colder, quieter place. The seafloor here is not perfectly smooth. It has small ridges, cracks, and pockets, microhabitats where currents shift just a little, or where a bit more organic matter settles and stays. In those tiny shelters, there might be more diverse invertebrate communities than our cameras have managed to catch so far. Worms, tiny sea cucumbers, or other soft-bodied creatures, all moving rarely, feeding cautiously, living for many years on very little. Any complex ecosystem at these depths would have to be like that, slow-moving, exquisitely energy-efficient, built on recycling every fragment of carbon, every trace of nutrient, again and again. So when we ask what lives below Challenger Deep, we can sketch outlines now with more confidence than we could a few decades ago. We can say that life is likely thin but persistent, that it bends itself around pressure and darkness instead of breaking. But the full picture is still like a painting seen in very dim light, with whole regions of the canvas lost in shadow, somewhere in those shadows, just beyond the reach of our brief dives and fragile instruments. Other forms and relationships may be waiting, and in the next part of our journey, we'll turn toward how we might, one day, see them more clearly. Why we can't just build stronger submarines and be done. So as we sit with that half-seen painting in the dark, it's tempting to reach for a very simple answer. If the problem is pressure, we might think, then why not just make our machines stronger, thicker, tougher, until the deep can't touch them anymore? It sounds so direct, so reassuringly mechanical, like tightening a bolt. But now, picture what happens when we actually try to do that. At nearly 11,000 meters down, every square centimeter of hull is carrying the weight of a small building. And to resist that, we wrap our vehicles in layers of dense metal. Each extra centimeter of thickness adds strength, yes, but it also adds mass, and that mass has to be lifted, controlled, and brought safely back to the surface through cold, shifting water. The returns get smaller, while the penalties grow. We often picture a submersible as a single heroic shell, a kind of metallic bubble holding out against the world's deepest pressure. In reality, it is more like a fragile village of systems, each one with its own limits. The main pressure sphere might survive, but the cables, the batteries, the cameras, the tiny seals around connectors all have to either endure that same crushing forces, making every wire and circuit truly at home at the bottom of the ocean is far harder than simply thickening one hull. Imagine trying to build a laptop that can sit for years at the bottom of Challenger Deep, in utter darkness, under more than 1,000 atmospheres, and still send its thoughts back through 11 kilometers of water. It isn't just a question of material strength. It becomes a question of power, of heat, of communication, of how you even test such a thing without destroying it. Each improvement in one part of the system often exposes a weakness in another. And even if, one day, we could lower something almost indestructible into that hidden place, our work would not be over. Machines break, sensors drift out of calibration, tiny organisms from the deep might grow on surfaces we thought were inert. To maintain and repair such a craft, we would need to haul it up and down through that full column of water, again and again, spending years of effort and vast resources for every small adjustment. So the barrier is not a single wall we can punch through with a stronger fist. It is a whole landscape of limits, where materials, energy, logistics, and our human priorities all meet. As we follow this landscape further, make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts, because next we're going to look at how, instead of fighting the deep with brute force, we might learn to work with its quiet, relentless conditions. The ocean as a mirror. What Challenger Deep tells us about ourselves. As we follow this landscape further, we start to notice something quiet and a little unsettling. The way Challenger Deep keeps acting like a mirror, reflecting our own habits back at us. We are drawn to it partly because it is extreme, because it sits at the far edge of what we can touch on this Earth, the deepest known point in the global ocean, where the pressure is more than 1,000 times what you feel at the surface. We often picture the world in terms of its edges like this, don't we? The highest peaks, where the air thins and the ice never fully melts. The coldest deserts, where almost nothing moves for years at a time. The deepest trenches, where light never arrives and water presses inward like a solid wall. It is as if, by tracing these outlines, we are quietly testing the outlines of ourselves, wondering how far our presence can reach before it begins to blur. Now, picture what happens when all our technology arrives at that edge. We bring titanium spheres, thick viewports, carefully engineered submersibles that can sink 11 kilometers down, and cables that hum softly with data. For a few hours, we land on the seafloor, we film a patch of sediment, we watch amphipods drift past in the dark. Then the dive ends, the vehicle rises, and the trench closes over us again, unchanged and unreachable. Not because we do not try, but because some places simply resist being held. Challenger Deep sits exactly in that tension. It symbolizes our achievements, that we have even managed to visit a realm where every square centimeter of hull feels the weight of entire buildings, and delicate life still survives beneath. Yet it also marks our limits, because we cannot dwell there, cannot leave a long-lived observatory watching quietly for years, cannot see how its hidden ecosystems feed and grow when we are not looking. For all our instruments, all our models, all our restless curiosity, most of its story remains untold. There is a strange comfort in that. We're going to suggest something that might feel a little unusual in a world that loves complete answers. Perhaps there is value in having places that stay partially unknown, places that ask us to slow our thoughts instead of racing toward quick conclusions, that teach patience rather than conquest, that remind us that not every mystery exists to be solved on our schedule. If you like, follow me for a moment into something more personal. Imagine your own deep trenches that you carry within you, questions you circle around but never quite finish, memories that sit just out of reach, feelings that cannot be fully mapped or explained. You cannot live at the bottom of those either, and yet you can visit them gently, with curiosity and respect, learning from the approach rather than from total control. In that way, Challenger Deep is not only a place on the map, but a way of seeing. It whispers that it is possible to care about a world we can barely touch, to keep asking careful questions even when answers come back slowly, and to accept that some cold, dark spaces will always stay partly beyond us. In the next part of our journey, we'll lean into that idea and explore what it means to keep listening to a depth that mostly answers with silence. A final descent, visualizing the journey from surface to seafloor. So now, let's lean into that silence together, and instead of trying to break it, we're going to drift through it. Make yourself comfortable, slow your thoughts just a little, and follow me as we retrace the long fall from the bright surface to the deepest known place on Earth. We begin where the air and the ocean touch, at the surface, in a world that feels familiar. Sunlight on small waves, the skin of the sea shifting and glittering, ships and birds and the restless weather of the open Pacific. Here the water is warm, colors are vivid, and most of the life we know from documentaries crowds this thin, illuminated film. Darting fish, drifting jellyfish, floating plankton turning light into food. Now picture what happens as we let our imaginary submersible sink. Within the first few 100 meters, the blue begins to thicken, then darken. Reds and oranges vanish first, then yellows, until only a muted blue-green remains. The water cools, the pressure climbs steadily, and the sounds of the surface fade into a soft, distant murmur, like a memory we can still feel but no longer quite hear. We slip through the twilight zone, where the last threads of natural light die away. The temperature falls toward a steady cold, the kind that does not sting but simply surrounds, patient and unchanging. Around us, sparse silhouettes move, long, ribbon-like fish, transparent bodies with tiny pinpricks of bioluminescent blue and green. We often picture this as empty, but it is more like a vast, suspended city at night, thinned out over hundreds of meters, each small light a quiet life trying to endure. Deeper still, into the midnight zone, where sunlight never reaches at all. Here, the pressure is already dozens, then hundreds of times what we feel at the surface, squeezing hull and bone and even water itself. Strange shapes drift past our lights, an anglerfish with its glowing lure, a comb jelly scattering faint rainbows, a squid flashing and then vanishing into blackness. In the far distance, perhaps, a hydrothermal vent glows like a submerged campfire, feeding pale crabs and ghostly worms on chemical energy instead of light. But we do not stop there. We sink beyond the ridges and vents, leaving even those familiar deep-sea landmarks behind, down the steep inner wall of the Mariana Trench, where the seafloor drops away into a narrow hidden crease in the Earth's crust. The cold stays almost the same, but the pressure keeps building past the limits of most metals, past what almost any machine can bear for long. Outside our imagined window, there is only black water and falling flakes of marine snow, the slow rain of dead plankton and dust that has taken years to descend. At last, we settle onto the floor of Challenger Deep, nearly 11 kilometers beneath the surface, where every square inch of our hull bears the weight of a small building. The scene is quiet, and in its own way simple. A soft, muddy plain with gentle ripples, a few scattered rocks, maybe the faint track of something that crawled by hours ago. A translucent amphipod scuttles over the sediment. A snailfish hovers and then disappears, and the marine snow lands in tiny, patient puffs, building a thin archive of time. We have stitched this picture from brief dives, from scattered images, from instruments that endured the pressure for only a short while. Part of it is data. Part of it is imagination. Could the real seafloor be emptier than this, or stranger than this, or both at once? As we rise back toward the surface in our thoughts, we'll turn to that uncertainty itself and ask what it means that even here, At Earth's deepest point, the truth may still be hiding just out of reach. What we know, what we guess, and what we may never see. So, before we drift too far from that imagined seafloor, let's make yourself comfortable with what we actually know, what we carefully suspect, and what may always stay just out of sight. We're going to separate the firm ground from the soft, shifting silt of our guesses, even here, where there is almost no ground at all, only a deep fold in the earth. First, the solid pieces. Challenger Deep lies in the western Pacific, in the Mariana Trench, a narrow wound where one plate of the Earth's crust slides beneath another and disappears into the mantle. Its deepest surveys put it around 10,900 to 11,000 meters below the surface, under more than 1,000 times the pressure you feel right now, enough to crush most metal spheres like thin ice. Down there, it is always night, always cold, a place where the seafloor is steep, fractured, and dusted with fine sediment that has been falling for years. Within that darkness, we have met a few residents directly. Cameras and landers have recorded pale amphipods, shrimp-like scavengers drifting and hopping over the mud, and ghostly snailfish at slightly shallower Haddle depths, their bodies flexible and gel-like so they can survive the pressure. Sediment cores and water samples have revealed dense communities of microbes feeding on chemical traces and on the slow rain of organic debris from the world above. These are not rumors. These are neighbors we have sampled, measured, sequenced. But to reach them, we lean on fragile machines. Only a handful of crude submersibles, from Trieste in 1960 to more recent visits by limiting factor, have touched the bottom, each dive lasting only hours before the hull, the batteries, and the pilots must return to safer water. Robotic landers and remotely operated vehicles have followed, their housings thick, their electronics carefully protected, yet still vulnerable to leaks, to tiny flaws that become fatal under that pressure. Some, like the hybrid vehicle Nereus, were lost completely, breaking apart in the deep, a quiet reminder that the environment does not forgive even small mistakes. From these brief risky encounters, we build plausible inferences. If microbes thrive in a few cores, they likely form diverse mats and films across the trench floor. If amphipods gather quickly around baited cameras, there may be whole scavenger communities linked by slow, sparse food chains, perhaps joined by rarer, more complex animals we have only glimpsed or not seen at all. Now, picture what happens when a whale carcass drifts down, or a storm above sends an extra pulse of particles. For a little while, this cold, hidden world might flare into activity we have never watched continuously. And that is where the gaps open. We do not know how these animals behave hour by hour, season by season, or across years. We cannot yet track migrations along the trench walls, or see how fragile species respond to subtle shifts in chemistry, or reconstruct in detail how life adapted, step by step, to survive such depth over geological time. Our instruments arrive, record for a short window, and leave. The long conversations of the ecosystem continue without us. So for now, what lives below Challenger Deep is a layered answer. A small set of confirmed residents, a larger circle of strongly supported possibilities, and then a wide halo of mystery that may persist for generations. Not because we lack curiosity, but because the Earth itself, in this one cold, deep place, sets limits on how closely we can watch. As we look ahead, will follow me into the tools and ideas that might, someday, let us listen longer to that darkness, or teach us to accept that some parts of our own planet will always remain partly untold. You and the deep, carrying the abyss into everyday life. So now, as that cold, distant trench settles in the back of our minds, we're going to turn gently towards something much closer. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are right now, and notice the simple fact that you can think about the deepest place on Earth while sitting in a chair or lying in a bed in a small, familiar room. The Mariana Trench, may be almost 11 kilometers beneath the ocean surface, yet the whole shape of it fits inside your quiet attention. We often picture Challenger Deep as a faraway dot on a globe, a remote hollow pressed down by unimaginable pressure. But in this moment, it is also just an image suspended in your inner world, no heavier than a passing thought. Imagine the contrast. Out there, a darkness so complete that even bioluminescent sparks are rare. In here, perhaps the soft glow of a lamp or the dim light of a screen and the steady rhythm of your breathing. Two very different places, resting together in one mind. Now, picture what happens if we treat ourselves the way we treat the ocean. At the surface of our awareness are the quick, choppy waves of daily life. Messages, tasks, worries that skim across like wind on water. Beneath that, there are slower currents, the concerns that return over days or years, like deep tides shaping the seafloor without ever being seen. And then, far below, there are regions as quiet as Challenger Deep, places in us that we rarely visit, where thoughts move slowly and almost nothing disturbs the dark. We do not have to map those inner trenches completely. Not every question we carry needs to be drilled into or solved, in the same way that not every fold of the real trench must be charted to the last meter. Some mysteries can be companions rather than problems, steady presences that walk beside us for years, reminding us that a life does not have to be fully explained to be fully lived. If you like, you can let the trench become a kind of mental refuge, a cold, silent canyon at the edge of imagination. Follow me for a moment. Picture a narrow submersible light drifting down and then switching off, leaving only darkness, soft silt, and the immense unhurried weight of the water above. Down there, nothing demands an instant reply. No notification can reach that depth. Time stretches, and thoughts can sink until they settle. As we sit here together, you might let one small worry drop into that imagined abyss, not to lose it forever, but simply to let it fall out of urgency, to rest on the seafloor for a while. Notice how your shoulders feel, the contact of your body with the bed or the chair, the gentle rise and fall of your chest. The image of the trench can fade now, like a distant coastline in fog, while the reality of your own breathing comes back into focus. In a moment, we'll return to the tools and ideas waiting at the surface, but for now, you can stay here, hovering calmly between the known and the unknown. Soft recap, letting the deep settle into the background. So as we hover there, between the known and the unknown, we can slowly let the whole journey drift back into view, like a tide returning over a quiet shore. We started far above, with waves touching starlight, with ships and satellites skimming the surface of the Earth, while, far beneath them, the real descent waited in the dark. From there, we followed the slope down, past the bright, busy shallows and the dim blue middle depths, until the colors thinned out and the water turned almost completely black. We crossed the calm plains of the abyss, then stood, in our minds, at the lip of the trench itself, looking into a cut in the planet so deep that Mount Everest could vanish inside it and still be drowned in cold, invisible water. Then we sank, step by patient step, into that cut. We felt the pressure rise, not as a number, but as a weight building slowly on every square inch, until we were imagining thousands of meters of water above us, pressing down with more force than steel should reasonably bear. We passed the quiet drift of sinking snow, the scattered flashes of life that can endure where light does not, and we came to rest, at least in thought, on the floor of Challenger Deep. Down there, we met a world that is both absolutely of this earth and strangely beyond our reach, a place where amphipods and snailfish and microscopic cells have reshaped themselves over millions of years, learning to live where the pressure would crush almost anything we build. It is a world that our submersibles can only visit for hours at a time, where our instruments bend, fail, or fall silent, leaving long stretches of the trench's chemistry, its rocks, its hidden currents, and its food webs as unanswered questions. If some of those details have already blurred for you, that is more than all right. You do not need to remember the exact depth in meters, or how many dives have reached the bottom, or which sensors can survive the journey. The point was never to memorize a catalog. It was to make yourself comfortable with the idea of a deep, unseen place, to slow your thoughts enough that scale and silence could wash gently over you. We often picture exploration as noise and bright lights and flags, but the kind of exploration we share here is quieter. On this channel, we're going to keep taking you into hidden corners of the world, into ice and rock and water, into places beneath the surface that most of us will only ever visit in imagination, in videos that can sit beside sleep, or study, or a still evening when the day has finally let you go. So, follow me back up just a little, to that feeling of having traveled a long way together in almost complete silence. Thank you for lending your attention, your time, and your curiosity to this slow descent. For now, you can let Challenger Deep sink back into the background of your mind, knowing it is there, waiting, while we return, gently, to the world above. If you'd like to return to the deep, a gentle invitation, as we settle back on this side of the surface, with the cold weight of that deep place still lingering somewhere in the background, there is one more small thing we're going to do together. Not another descent, not another pressure calculation or hidden creature, but a quiet decision about whether you'd like to return here, to this kind of slow journey again. If you'd like more nights or afternoons, where we drift through other trenches across the dark floor of the Pacific, or imagine the buried oceans beneath icy moons, you're welcome to make yourself comfortable here and stay. We often picture exploration as loud and triumphant, but there is room for a gentler kind of curiosity, the kind that moves at the pace of a drifting current. And if you subscribe or follow, this is the kind of world we're going to keep visiting. Subglacial lakes under Antarctica, forests of ice beneath Greenland, perhaps even the hidden rivers under a glacier on Mars. You have probably heard many times that likes, comments, and sharing are important. Here, they are something a little different. Not scores to chase, but faint, steady signals, like distant beacons on a dark ocean, that tell the algorithms this quiet corner of the internet should not be buried beneath louder, faster waves of content. When you tap a like, or leave even a few words, it helps this calm space stay visible to the people who might need it most, on nights when their thoughts refuse to slow. You can also treat this video as something you can return to whenever you wish. If you are studying, and you want a long, even companion in the background, the steady presence of the deepest point on Earth will still be here. If you are trying to sleep, and your mind keeps climbing back to the surface, you can always come back and let it sink again, gently, toward that invisible floor where light never reaches and time feels less sharp around the edges. And if you happen to still be awake, if your eyes are open and your thoughts are not too far away, I would be quietly curious to know where you listened from. Was it a small city apartment with the glow of streetlights on the wall? A rural house where the night outside is very dark? A dorm room with thin walls and distant voices? Or some other place on this turning Earth? When you share that in the comments, you help sketch a scattered map of listeners, a loose constellation of people connected by nothing more than curiosity and a shared willingness to sit with the unknown for a while. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour is for you, my hope is simple, that your night or your day feels a little quieter now, a little wider, for having let your imagination sink all the way down to Challenger Deep and return again. May the world beneath the waves keep you company when you need it, and may the surface you're about to fall asleep on feel just a bit softer, knowing how much vastness rests beneath your feet. Drifting upward, a soft farewell from the ocean floor. So now, as we let that vastness settle, we're going to turn gently away from it. We won't close a door on Challenger Deep. We'll simply begin to rise, as if the ocean itself has taken a slow breath in and is carrying us upward on the exhale. Imagine the seafloor falling away beneath us, not suddenly, but inch by inch, grain by grain, until the fine sediment and scattered rocks blur into a soft, dark haze. The trench walls, so steep and severe on the way down, become only suggestions at the edge of awareness, more memory than landscape, a cold, hidden outline fading into the black. The pressure is still immense, the world is still deep, but we're no longer pinned to the bottom. We're drifting. Follow me for a moment as we rise through water that looks perfectly empty and yet is quietly full. We pass through layers we cannot see, the slow arcs of tiny amphipods, the almost still hover of microbes feeding on traces of sinking life, perhaps a lone snailfish far above the trench floor, its body shaped by years of darkness and weight. None of them notice us, or if they do, they accept us as just another brief disturbance in an old, patient world. Now picture what happens as time stretches. Minutes feel like hours, and hours feel like the long, unbroken night of the deep ocean. Yet we keep drifting upward, through zones where no sunlight has ever reached, then into regions where a few wandering photons have managed to survive the journey down from the surface. The black becomes not bright, but less absolute, as if someone has opened a door in a distant room and let in the faintest line of light. We often picture the surface of the sea as a hard boundary, a sharp line between water and air, between this world and ours. But from down here, it's more like a slow brightening, a gentle loosening of the dark. As we rise, Challenger Deep recedes behind us, not lost, not conquered, simply set back on a shelf in the mind, like a dream you can return to whenever you wish to walk its floor again. Make yourself comfortable as that image drifts farther away. If your thoughts feel heavy, you can let them lighten, the way water warms as it climbs toward the sun, the way waves smooth themselves out as they approach a calm shore. You don't need to hold on to the details now. The numbers, the depths, the crushing weight. You can let them dissolve, like sand slipping through open fingers. If you'd like, you can let your breathing match this slow ascent. Each inhale a small rise toward the surface. Each exhale a soft pause where you simply float. It's all right if your attention wanders, or if the edges of these words begin to blur. Your mind is allowed to be like the shallow sea, stirred gently by currents, clear in some places, cloudy in others. It's also all right to let go of Challenger Deep for tonight. Some mysteries can rest quietly at the edge of awareness, neither solved nor forgotten, just waiting in that calm, dark place beneath your everyday thoughts. You don't have to carry the whole ocean with you. You can leave most of it where it belongs. So if your eyes are closing, you can let them close. If the room around you is dim, you can imagine it dimming a little more, like the lights of a research vessel slowly being switched off one by one, while the sea remains vast and unchanged. Just outside, this space will be here whenever you choose to return, whenever you feel like sinking back down through the water to visit that hidden floor again. For now, we'll stop our descent and our questions and let the silence take over where the story ends. Thank you for keeping watch with us above the deepest point on Earth. Sleep if you wish, or simply rest in the quiet. We'll be waiting somewhere between the surface and the deep.